Hi, I'm Kevin Kaminski. I'm one of the AppV MVPs based out of Canada. Actually, I think I'm the only one now. Um, I'm more known for being part of Big Hat Group. I actually do a lot of work with a bigger company known as Cortex Staffing and Professional Services. I know that's a mouthful, but there's a few Cortex in the world. I think some of you might know the Danish Cortex, and there's another one in the States, so there's all sorts of fun naming problems. Today, what I'm going to do is go through some concepts. So there's going to be three primary concepts around AppV, but I'm going to do a bit of an introduction about what is application virtualization, or what is an application, explain state separation quickly, and then talk about how this creates problems with application compatibility shims, and how you can use shims with AppV to overcome application compatibility issues. Also, we're going to talk about using device drivers with AppV and some of the practices around that and how you can use device drivers with AppV. And then finally, I'm going to do a little bit on Procmon because I don't think Procmon and AppV is really well documented. So when we're talking about what essentially an application is, what I like to do is just start off mentioning or calling out the operating system. The reason why I think this is very important is because you sort of have the user mode, kernel mode in memory, and there is there's a need for the operating system. So, you know, I get a lot of people that have misconceptions around application virtualization because they forget about the fact that you still need an underlying operating system for your applications to run. So if I pop in my application, typically we know that the application has some registry and some files, executables, data, and those sorts of things. And then we know the operating system as well has different registry entries and system files. But in an ideal world, things would be broken across this line very cleanly, and it'd be very easy to differentiate between application files and registry and the system files and registry. The reality is that when we're looking at the operating system, when we install an application, the application tends to overlap and modify that host operating system. And that can cause problems in some, over the course of time, because as you add applications, they overlap with the operating system and they overlap with each other. And eventually your operating system environment becomes this soup, for lack of a better word. And what we like to do is with application virtualization, we do state separation. So we're pulling these applications out of the operating system and isolating them, giving them a virtual registry, giving them a virtual file system, doing some COM isolation and other tricks to make things much more clean and manageable. The problem with this is it introduces problems, and the big thing is that I'll talk about later is how this affects shims and device drivers. But before we go into that, I wanted to talk about what an application compatibility shim actually is. And an application compatibility shim is one of those neat things that's built into the operating system and really hasn't gained a lot of traction until recently with Windows 7. Windows Vista, they were sort of talking about it, but when you got to Windows 7, this started to become a hot topic because application compatibility is usually one of your biggest issues in deploying a new operating system. So for example, this screenshot here is the properties of basically a Dameware executable, but I went to the compatibility tab, and here you can see some high-level compatibility settings you can apply to your application. So here I can set a compatibility mode for Windows Vista or Windows XP. It's not truly Windows Vista or Windows XP. Microsoft has defined a series of fixes to emulate that operating system. And it's kind of a good start if you're looking for a quick win, but it's not a best practice because you're not identifying what is actually required in terms of modifying your operating system behavior for the application. Below this, we have some more settings that overcome typical challenges, such as running the application with 256 colors, lying to the application saying that the screen resolution is 640 by 480, or disabling themes, because some applications, they don't render their user interface correctly on newer operating systems, so disabling visual themes for that application sometimes is of an advantage. And then at the privilege level, you know, if you're dealing with UAC issues, sometimes you have to flag the application as requiring administrator privileges, and you can do that down there. And if you notice at the bottom, you have an option of doing this per user or per machine, which is something that was new to me, is that some of this stuff actually can be isolated to a specific user. Now, I'm not sure why you'd want to shim an application only for a specific user, but you know, the functionality exists in the operating system. So to understand what a shim is, it applies to applications that use the portable executable format. So as long as you're not using DOS, or DOS applications, you're probably okay. So Win16, Win32.net, all that stuff falls under this specification. Even Unix, they use this type of executable specification. The way to tell that it's a portable executable format is to know that generally it'll rely on one or more DLLs for the application to work. When applications are launched, essentially the system is going to check every application that is launched to see if it needs to be shimmed at launch time. And this is important for when the fix is applied. And if one or more shims are required for the application, the behavior of one or more DLLs or APIs can be altered. So the shim really comes in and it's modifying DLL behaviors. And that's key to application compatibility, because if you remember the model of the application and the operating system, some people assume that just because you put your application inside AppV and it's sequenced, that all of a sudden the constraints of having operating system compatibility go away. And that is completely wrong. You should be looking at, oh, if there's an operating system incompatibility, can I shim it? Because that's really the better answer. Application virtualization can be used to overcome some compatibility challenges, but it's usually application to application compatibility, and it's not application to operating system incompatibility. So under the covers with the shim, you have to understand that when a portable executable exe is loaded, it binds to a bunch of DLLs when it's launched, and in order to keep track of what these mappings are, a thing called an import address table is built so that the mapping of these DLLs is basically attached to the executable. Now, this is built at launch time, and this all sort of happens all at once. But the thing is that all your DLLs should be loaded in at this time for most applications. And any shims that need to be applied will modify this import address table. So this is how the magic happens, is when this import address table is being built, the shims identified by the operating system will also be loaded, and DLL behaviors modified by having other DLLs take over the behavior of certain functions. So if you don't believe me, you can see signs of the Shim Engine within the operating system. So you can look at HKey, current user, software, Microsoft, Windows NT, current version, app compat flags, or HKey local machine, software, Microsoft, Windows NT, current version, app compat flags. And if you go into the Windows folder, so if you go into C Windows, you should notice an app patch folder and a bunch of DLLs in there. And these DLLs basically are your shims. So this engine lives within the operating system, and this is important when we introduce AppV later on. But before we introduce AppV, I just want to do a quick demo to kind of show you what I mean about a shim being applied. So what I'm going to do here is go over to my client machine, and essentially I have FileZilla here, and I have a tool called Dependency Walker. Now, Dependency Walker, it's a little too techy for most systems administrators, but the thing is that I used to use this for troubleshooting back when AppV was SoftGrid, because the thing you could do with this tool is basically I could go and open up an executable. So in this case, I'm going to go and grab FileZilla. And what it does is it scans the header of the executable to understand the DLL mappings, which is generally useful, but the thing is that usually this doesn't get you a lot of value. Where this tool gave me a lot of value is when you profile executables. So it would actually watch the executables launch, it would see the DLLs load, and you could get an idea whether or not you had some low-level issues with your application at the COM level. So here, you know, in the middle, it already says I'm missing a file. You have to watch out for that because sometimes that really isn't something that's part of your problem. Usually I ignore those sorts of errors right off the bat. If I do a trace or a profile of the application and it pops in more missing DLLs, then I know I probably have a big problem. The other thing I liked about this tool is you could see failed DLL calls, and if you Googled up the name of the API demo application because, you know, I figure you guys all know how to make a simple app-v package. What I am going to do is I'm going to go and install the application compatibility toolkit, which is pretty much a brain-dead setup. It's essentially next, next, next. And that's going to install the tools I need to shim the application, with the exception of one dependency. And I don't know why they made this dependency separate, but once I've installed the application compatibility toolkit, well, here, I'll just quickly walk through the GUI. So next, accept the license terms, next, next, install. So once I get that installed, I also need application verifier installed. So there's application verifier and it's processor architecture dependent. So there's actually 3 different installs of the application verifier. And maybe that's why it's a separate download. I would have preferred to have everything in one installer if I had my say. So once we get these 2 pieces down, I'll be able to successfully shim an application. And while we're waiting, and to also keep you guys awake, I guess raise your hand if you know the answer. Basically, which company developed this technology before Microsoft acquired it? Now, if you're at the Geek Speak, yes? Softricity, yes. Here, you can have 8 gigs of fun. Whoop, good. So I'm also gonna install the application verifier, which is a painfully simple install as well. You know, accept the EULA, click next, next, and eventually you get to the end. So the great thing about the application compatibility toolkit is you have different tools. Now, there's the compatibility administrator. There's even the ability to go out and have it identify applications on computers through a discovery method and do all sorts of compatibility analysis with the online compatibility community. I'm not going to talk about that piece of the tool. What I'm going to focus on is the easy to use piece for making shims. And so before I go there, I just want to point out this subfolder. So I'm going to use an application called Stock Viewer, which is intentionally a bad application. And beside it, make sure to note that there's an XPS document that comes with it. So after you've seen all this wonderful stuff, you can actually pick up that document, and there's a series of labs in that document that take you through the different features of making shims. So there's even, you know, some free educational material that comes with this. So what I'm going to show you is how to use the tool under Developer and Tester Tools called the Standard User Analyzer Wizard. So when I launch this application, it walks me through the process of building a shim fairly easily. There we go. So all you have to do is click the button to browse for an application. And what I'm going to do is go into Compatibility Administrator, and there's Demo Application, there's Stock Viewer, and I'm going to select Stock Viewer. And I'm going to launch Stock Viewer. So I get a UAC prompt from the Application Compatibility Toolkit because it needs to do some admin level tasks. And what it's going to essentially do is monitor this application, launch it and monitor it. And what it's looking for is application behaviors that are known to be bad, specifically for users running without administrator privileges. So you notice my first error is you must be an administrator to run this program. Awesome. Then it opens, but still, I don't want to have that error when the application launches. Also, I don't know what else is breaking because of rights issues. So I'm going to close the application, and the wizard's going to come back to me and it's going to ask, did the application finish running without any problem? And I'm going to say, no, there were issues. And based on the application behavior, I now have a selection of fixes that I can apply to this application to remedy the bad behavior. So my favorite is force admin access, because that is probably the most common shim that is used to fake out application admin rights. So force admin access doesn't give the application administrator access. What it does is the application goes to the operating system and says, hey, I need to be an administrator. And the operating system goes, okay, you have the administrator token, but never actually passes the token. It just lies. And this usually gets around a lot of application issues when they think they need administrator rights. If you look up here, the correct file paths is also another very useful fix, because you can redirect where the application is writing file system data. And you can do similar things with the registry. So if it thinks HKey local machine software is a great place to write user data in the registry, you can change it to somewhere else. Same with like C program files. If you think certain things shouldn't be written to C program files but should be written to the user profile, you can now intercept that and redirect the file system I/O to a different location. So now what I can do is I can click launch, and what it's going to do is it's going to apply the fixes that have been checked off and see if the application runs correctly. So I don't have to go and revert my machine. I don't have to clean it up or anything. I just install my shims into the system or activate the shims and basically see if my application works. So now it launches, no errors, happy times for the user. And so what I can do now is close my application, and it's going to come back and it's going to ask me whether or not this was actually successful. And I'm going to say, yes, it worked wonderful. And then it has an export button. So this couldn't be any easier. I click export, and it says, hey, I'm going to make you an MSI file. And it's like, awesome. So now what I can do is I can go to my network drive here, and I'm just going to save this MSI file up here. Now, what I can do, just before I flip to the other machine, I should actually revert this guy. Oh, whoops, wrong one. Hopefully that doesn't slow things down too much. So on my client machine, what I can do is I'm going to take that shim, and I'm going to essentially install it. So stockviewer.exe.msi, going to run it. It's going to configure Windows to shim stockviewer when it sees it. And what I've done is, to save some time, because I had to cut some corners on the demos just for time's sake, I assume you know how to sequence an application. I already sequenced the stockviewer application without any shims. I just sequenced it as is, and I already have the sequence installed over here. So once I get my shim installed, what I'm going to do is launch the stockviewer application and show you how the Shim Engine will still intercept that virtual application and patch it. So here I go to run my stockviewer application. It's launching as it normally would with AppV. And, you know, you won't see anything, but I shouldn't see any error messages. So there you go, successful application launch with AppV. So really, you can leverage this technology with AppV. The challenge is delivering the fix to the client system to make a positive user experience. So there's some synchronization that has to happen depending on what delivery technologies you have as an option. You may decide that it's a deal breaker. You may decide that, no, there's too many moving parts. I'm going to just do this as a physical installation. But again, it depends. How badly do you want this as a virtual application? If you're very focused on virtual applications, then you may decide that this is a good approach. So, device drivers. So, key thing with device drivers is they run in the kernel memory space, and that's a bad thing for application virtualization because application virtualization is focused on running user mode applications. So, user mode applications run in a different memory space than the kernel. The kernel tends to be protected, and you only really want device drivers running there. You don't want actual applications running in the kernel because if the kernel goes sideways, chances are you get a blue screen or some sort of epic failure on your system. The installers can vary for device drivers. Sometimes they're EXE, sometimes they're MSI, sometimes it's just here's the files, have fun. So really depends on where you're getting your device drivers from. And essentially they're there to provide functionality to communicate with hardware, but not always the case. Antivirus is an example. Even AppV uses device drivers to achieve some of its functionality. And not all drivers will work with virtual applications. So Shims, usually a good story. Drivers, really have to look at how badly you want your virtual application to work with drivers. And usually the drivers that don't work with AppV, it really depends how you're installing the driver. Yeah, I'll just go to a different slide before I dive deeper. Wanted to cover the driver files just so you know how to identify a driver. Typically, when you see a device driver, it's going to have an INF file. This is essentially the installation file that defines how you install the driver. You'll see a cat file if the driver is signed, and signed drivers are good. Depending on your security policy, you might not allow unsigned drivers in your environment. This is to ensure people aren't installing viruses, malware, and all sorts of stuff into your operating system, because if you're installing stuff at the kernel level, you have the potential to do very evil things because you get a lot of visibility into what's happening on the system. Sometimes there's an executable. The executable is usually for interaction with the end user. DLLs to support that executable. The .sys file is the driver itself. And sometimes you see these PDB files. These are files that contain debugging information, which can be very handy when your driver decides to be part of a blue screen. This is very good debugging information if you have somebody that can actually analyze the crash dumps for you. So when we're doing device driver interaction with AppV, it's a very similar story. When you install your application with the device driver, you know, things can work just fine, but when you do state separation, those driver files stay within the virtual environment, and that's a problem because virtual applications can't do any kernel mode virtualization, as well as the files needed to run the device driver are stuck in that virtual environment, so it's a bad situation. So how do we go about solving this? We go about solving this with different tools and solutions. And I wanted to start with introducing Diffix, D-I-F-X. It's Driver Installation Framework. It is your friend. I use it a lot, vendors use it a lot. This is really how you install device drivers on Windows. If you want, here's the full URL. I shortened it to bit.ly/ms-diffix if you want a nice short URL to the toolkit. It's in the Windows Driver Development Kit. It's a free tool or set of tools. And you can find it in the CWinDDK, and I got the Windows 7 version, so it's like 7600.16385/redist/diffix. And when you look at Diffix, it comes in many flavors. And Diffix can install device drivers from a command prompt using dpinst.exe. Very simple to implement. It can be a command line or can be manual. Usually if I need to test a device driver installation, what I do is I just drop dpinst into the same folder as the driver files, double-click dpinst, go next, next, next. Oh, did it install? Great. If you want to get fancy, they have MSI merge module for it. The problem with the MSI merge module is you actually have to create custom tables in your MSI to program the feature. But once you learn to do it, it's actually not too bad. But if you haven't built custom tables in an MSI before, yeah, it's going to teach you how to do that. And this is new. I didn't know that they have a Wix lib. So if you have Wix developers for building MSIs, they actually have a library for that. And then if you're super hardcore, they just have in the right state. So usually what I do is I'll sequence my application, and then I'll go back and I'll go and install my application again and then harvest the drivers. And the final option I put here is maybe you can hack the vendor MSI or installer to only install the device driver. That I consider almost the option of last resort, because chances are if you're relying on that, you're desperate, and chances are it's going to be very difficult to program the MSI, because most MSIs aren't programmed to just install the driver. So you can do some very creative things in some cases, but it can be time consuming. And again, how badly do you need it to work this way? You know, when I do a OS migration project, it's all about time boxing. What is the maximum amount of time I'm going to spend on a particular solution before I go, nope, this is a waste of time, I need to go to a different solution. Maybe I need to deploy this application to Citrix. Maybe I need to give them a local VM that runs the application and the device driver routes through to USB or something like that. So you really got to pick your battles when packaging, because it's very easy to burn time and make your project manager angry. So I'm going to show you how to collect and install device drivers. Oop, I guess I got to get moving. So here's going to be a fun question. Can anybody tell me what the latest version, not beta, of AppV got released? Oh, nobody's been watching their Twitter feeds? Oh, no. What? Oh, close. Okay, I was looking for hotfix 6. So 4.6 SP1 hotfix 6 came out. Okay, so I'm on my sequencer machine, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly, because of time, I'm going to skip sequencing the actual application. I'm going to go strictly to harvesting the driver. So I've already sequenced an application that's got, it's a virtual serial port application. And there, that's not quite it. That's better. It's a virtual serial port application, but what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to go and install it. So what I'm going to do here is grab its installer. I'm going to install the application. So the driver's unsigned, and I get a warning. I don't really care. And so it's going to put the driver down and the application. So here's my application. It's installed, happy, all that stuff. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to install Driver Magician to go in and harvest the driver for me. Yep. Ooh, Yeah, I actually don't think I put a link up for that. Here, let me see. I got internet, right? No, I don't. Oh, that's why. It's actually shareware, so you don't actually have to register to get the functionality you need, but I would say if you're going to actually use it, you know, give the guy some money. I actually know of another tool called Deploy Expert, but they actually harvest the drivers through the SCCM client. So as you deploy machines or load up machines with SCCM clients, it'll go, oh, you have a new model, and it'll load everything in. But this is a little bit more lightweight and probably more appropriate for sequencing. And those are the only two tools I know that actually do driver harvesting. So I'm going to do, I'm just going to ignore updating my driver database. I don't care. What I want to do is I want to grab this virtual serial bus emulator and also select it. So by default, it only shows me the non-Microsoft drivers, because chances are if you want to back up drivers, you don't want the drivers that come with Windows. You want the drivers that don't come with Windows. So all I have to do is hit Start Backup, and it'll say, where do you want to save it? And I'll just say, oh yeah, put it on my desktop. And now what it's going to do is it's going to go and harvest that driver and extract all the necessary files to install that driver at a later time. The only thing it doesn't give you is, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. This application actually can generate an installer for your drivers as well. I forgot. I'm just so in the mode of using dpinst. So, you know, that's just the way I do things. So, got an easy one then. So, what is the version of AppV that's currently in beta? Yes? 5, yes. Awesome. Here, I'll try to not hit people. Okay, so I got my driver backed up, and what I'm going to do is go into the folder, and I'm going to grab this driver, and I'm going to go back over to my network folder, and I'm going to copy the driver up here. I'm going to take my copy of dpinst.exe I've already extracted from the driver development kit. I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to put it in here. So now my driver package is ready to be installed, and you can see all the wonderful driver files in here, including a debug file as well. So if I go back to my client virtual machine, what I can do here is go to my virtual serial bus emulator driver files, run dpinst. I'll get a UAC prompt, and then dpinst will proceed to install my drivers, and because the drivers are unsigned and I didn't do it in legacy mode, I'll get these warnings. And because I'm testing things out, I'm not too concerned. I'm just fine, whatever. And while that's installing, I'll also grab, luckily I have a pre-sequenced version of that application. Yeah, I think that's, no, this is the good one. And so what I'm going to do is install the application I sequenced earlier. Oh, there we go. Awesome. So now that's installed. So up here I have the icon for my virtual serial port application. Now I can launch it, and I have a happy application now. So yeah, in some cases this works great. In other cases, you'll go through the process, it won't work at all. So again, How badly do you need this as a virtual application? How are we doing for time? Okay. Actually, we're not doing too bad, but now what we have to do is talk about Process Monitor. And Process Monitor, unlike Dependency Walker, is the official troubleshooting tool endorsed by Microsoft and promoted by Microsoft for tracking issues with sequencing. And it isn't useless. I just wish I could have all the tools I like to use with AppV. What Procmon does is it's basically a logging tool for process and thread activity with relation to registry access, file access, network activity, and most importantly, I find for certain issues is it logs the time and duration of events. So if you have performance issue with your virtual applications, sometimes this is really useful. I had an application that we couldn't figure out where the performance bottleneck was. We did a Procmon trace. We found that the application was hitting the same data file. I was opening and closing the file literally thousands of times a second, rather than just reading the data file, which was something like a few hundred K, and then processing it in memory. It insisted on opening and closing that file thousands of times a second, and when you do that in a virtual environment, apparently that's a bad thing. So, great for finding bad application behavior. Rights requirements, you do need to run it as an administrator. The user doesn't have to run their application as an administrator, but whoever's running Procmon has to have administrator rights. And just in case you're in a high security environment, that administrator also needs to be able to install device drivers, because in order for it to do its monitoring, it's installing a device driver at the kernel level to watch all this activity. If you're reading logs, you can be a regular user. Use the /openlog option, and if you're on a 64-bit system and you need to read 32-bit logs, you also have to know the /run32 command line option to open those logs. So when we're using Process Monitor, there's different ways of monitoring, and I'll explain the different ways of monitoring. So most commonly, what you can do is you can open up your shortcut properties, and you'll see a command line a lot like this for your virtual application shortcut. And you can add the command line option /exe space cmd.exe, and that'll launch a command prompt before your virtual application. So that command prompt is now inside your virtual application, and you can launch your tools inside of there. So if you're using this method, you should be using I believe it's a start command. Best practice is to launch Procmon and the AppV application using the command prompt. Oh, yes. Okay, sorry. Because of how things behave, you actually have to start both Procmon and the application you're trying to trace via the command prompt. Because if you launch Procmon from the command prompt, then close the command prompt closing then kills the child process, which is Procmon, and then the application it's supposed to launch fails with an error code. So it's messy. I'm not a fan of this, and I'll show you why later. The other option is Microsoft has a KB article. Microsoft says launch it outside the virtual environment using a script. So inside the OSD, inject this following script into there and have it run outside the virtual environment. And I looked at that, I'm like, well, why do you want to do it that way? Because you're running Procmon outside the virtual environment, and they're not using a flag that I think they should be using, because it's not mentioned in the KB article. When you're doing this method, you can launch Procmon with the start command, and that splits it up from the actual command prompt. So if you close the command prompt, it'll actually launch the virtual application you're trying to trace, and Procmon still continues to run. So And monitoring outside the sequence is where I think this is the best option and it's the least trouble. So what you do is you run procmon exe with / external capture. There used to be a flag in Vista called procmon.exe / hook registry. That is now old news. If you're going to run procmon.exe with external capture, and below is why. I did some tests with Adobe Reader and tried it in different scenarios. So if I run it inside the OSD with protect equals true with no external capture, I get about 430 items. And I apologize, I should have dropped that second line there. If I run it with protect equals false without external capture, I still only see 430 registry items when I launch and close Adobe. Now if I say protect equals false with external capture, I see roughly 988 registry entries in procmon. And if I run it outside the sequence with external capture, again, I'm seeing roughly 988 items in my procmon registry paths in my procmon trace. So based on this testing, my feeling is that you don't actually need to run procmon inside the OSD. You just need to remember to use external capture to get the information. I looked at the file system and I couldn't see any difference in the visibility in the file system. All I could see is a lot of difference in what was coming up in the registry. So, demo time with procmon. How are we doing for time? Okay, not too bad. So, oops, okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you a scenario that isn't looking at the registry visibility. I did want to show you how I came up with those numbers, but that got dropped due to time constraints. What I do want to show you is a scenario you could see in the real world. And the scenario is, so I'm going to launch GIMP. GIMP launches, and then I get an error saying zlib1.dll is missing. And that's great. Okay, it's missing. Why is it missing? I have no idea. So what I'm going to do is close this application, and I've already copied procmon to my system32 folder just to make it easier for troubleshooting. So I'm just going to open my command prompt that's elevated, and what I'm going to do is go procmon external capture. And that's going to bring up procmon. And the first thing it's going to have is this little dialog box asking for different filters. So I don't have a whole lot that's in my filter list. Here you can see it was set up by default to track Adobe Reader for my testing purposes. I'm going to change that. So I'm going to double click this line item and it's going to bring the filter back up into the editing level so I can actually edit the filter. And what I'm going to do is my filter is process name is acroread32.exe then include. I'm going to say process name contains GIMP, which is the name of my application. I know the executable's got a version in it and something like that, but I'm lazy. So I'm going to just click add, and it's going to see the activity of GIMP. So I'm going to click OK. As you can see, it's busy capturing in the background. Big thing to note with this, by default, it dumps all its logging into memory. And that can be a problem over a course of time. You might want to use a different command line option that I'll show you after this demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch GIMP. GIMP launches. It says zlib1.dll missing. That's awesome. Click OK, close. So now I got some data around what is going on in here. Now, I'm going to do a plug for a book that I don't write, but I think is like the gospel. I'm going to stop my capture by clicking the magnifying glass. But if you want to really understand the ins and outs of Procmon, the sysinternals administrator reference actually has a lot of good material, and I think it's the missing manual to a lot of these tools. They actually go and explain things in far better detail than the built-in help that comes with these applications. Because you'll notice things like name not found, okay, that's okay, but fast I/O disallowed. Oh no, is that a problem? Fast I/O disallowed just means that Windows tried to find that in the Windows cache, file cache, and it didn't exist. So it's not a fatal error. So understanding these traces takes some experience and some research. But what I want to do is simplify my trace. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to go and modify my filter, and I'm going to add another line. So what I'm going to say is path contains zlib1.dll. Add. And I'm going to click OK, and things become a whole lot easier to look at. So this is a classic trace for a missing DLL. And chances are the application is going to look where the DLL probably should be, and that's where GIMP is installed. But because it doesn't exist, it starts going through its path statement and trying to find this DLL wherever it can. So the system actually tries, honestly, to find this DLL for you, even if it doesn't exist where it thinks it should be. So I'm not going to go too much further in detail about troubleshooting, but what I'm going to do is show you how to fix this, because I don't know, I gimped GIMP on purpose. So what you need to do to fix this application, what I could do is I'm going to take my shortcut, force it to run as an administrator, and then also in the shortcut, I'm going to say sft-tray.exe. If you're using SCCM, change VApp launcher to sft-tray.exe, and you get the same result. And I'm going to go, because you need to use the flag /exe, and then I'm going to put in cmd.exe space, okay. So now I can launch GIMP. And I'm going to get my UAC prompt. And so I'm going to go to, where is it? CD program, oh, whoops. CD / program files / GIMP / bin. There we go. And if I do a dir for zlib, see, this is what I did. I just essentially renamed the DLL to cause it to break on launch. So what I'm going to do here is just rename zlib to its real name and exit out of here. Now I'm going to take off the command prompt. And on top of that, I'm also going to turn off the administrator flag so I can simulate it as a regular user. Double click. So normally you're not renaming DLLs. In the real world, usually what you're doing is you're fixing the COM registration and the registry, or sometimes you need to copy that DLL to a different location so the application will actually find it. But as you see, now GIMP is launching and it's going to go through its startup sequence. I'm just going to get out of this because I need to finish the deck right away. So important flags for Procmon, /backing file. So use an actual file rather than memory to log your Procmon log. No connect. So instead of monitoring right when you launch it, it waits for you to say, okay, now start monitoring. Except EULA gets rid of the EULA that shows up on first use. Load config, if you save specific filter configurations, you can load them from the command line. / profiling is thread profiling if you need to get into that level of detail. / minimized, minimize and startup, and / quiet gets rid of that filter settings dialog box on launch. So if you already know your filter settings, you can completely bypass that GUI on launch. So now we made it to the end, and how much time? Oh, we got like 4 minutes, so that's actually not half bad. So I got my blog up here, I got my Twitter, I tweet about random things that are interesting that I find in the IT world. My blog's a little bit stale, I really got to get on top of that, but there's still some good AppV stuff here. And here I got a bunch of shortened URLs and stuff for the different things you've seen today. So with that, let's open up the floor to any questions you might have. Yes?
Did you already try with the new AppV version 5, the user mode and machine mode scripting for better or extra possibilities for driver installs or Shim installs, or is that?
No, to be honest, with AppV 5, I haven't really battle tested that. Maybe because I'm not expecting a whole lot of that to be fixed. Ideally, I'd like to see them change the API hooking so that I can run dependency walker inside the sequence, because that used to be a favorite tool, because when a project manager would come to me and say, why doesn't this app virtualize? I could say, well, it looks like it's making this DLL call to Oracle that doesn't work. And they like having some sort of explanation. Microsoft just likes to go and say, yeah, doesn't work, not supported, move on. Well, project managers don't like that kind of lingo. They like to have usually some more explanation around it. There. Yeah, no problem. Anybody else? Yep. So, i.e., Tim has been spending too much time with the product. Oh, yeah, I forgot about that. I just also put a link in also for a guy that's called Gosh's site. And if you need to understand more about the INF file format and what actually happens in there, I found it to be the best reference I came across for that so far. Just curious, how many people currently shim applications today? Oh, okay. It's better than I thought. Do any of you use Install Shield or to do that, or no? No? Nobody's using the compatibility modules? Okay. We have it, but we don't use it. Yeah, so there are the compatibility modules in Install Shield if you have some money. And they offer a little bit more functionality than what I showed you with the LUA wizard. But LUA wizard, free. Install Shield, money. Okay. Well, I guess we'll leave it at that. I appreciate you all for coming out, and hope you got something out of this session.